Alrighty, so it looks like the enrollment is starting to slow down, and everyone that wants to be here is here. So we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar. Welcome to today's webinar, What Not to Do to Flourish as a Strategic Business Partner. A few housekeeping items before we jump into this. This webinar is pre-approved by the HR Certification Institute for 1 general recertification credit towards PHR, SPHR, and GPHR. To receive this credit, we ask that you attend at least 90% of the webinar. Related to housekeeping items, if you have any questions during the course of this webinar, all attendees will be on mute for the duration of the webinar, but you're welcome to insert any questions that you have as we go in the chat box. There's a question box that you can use. We'll also save some time at the end for dedicated question and answer time. So feel free to jump in as we go or wait till the end to ask your question. So a little bit of an introduction. I am Christy Panico, and I'm an industrial organizational psychologist by training. I am the Talent Solutions Manager here at Pinsight, and in my role I oversee a lot of our research and development initiatives, as well as our partner consultant accounts, and then the internal management of our contract or assessor pool. Joining me today is Janice Kaplan from the Scala Group. Janice has had very highly experienced in many aspects of talent management and HR. She's had a number of senior leadership roles in HR, and she currently consults and coaches with clients regarding methodologies for talent, succession, and career development. We're very excited to have Janice joining us today for this webinar. Janice, welcome. We're excited to have you. Would you mind spending a few minutes introducing the Scala Group?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to do so, and I'm really excited to be here with you, and thank you very much for that, Christy. The Scala Group, we're UK-based, but we do work globally. We have clients across all sectors in both public and private, and clients of all sizes, and we can work across the HR function, but we specialise particularly in leadership assessment and leadership development. They're our core competencies. Does that, yeah, okay. I'm happy to say
that's
more.
Great.
That's just
Thank
a snapshot.
you, Janice. And Janice and the Scala Group are one of our partners here at Pinsight. So they're delivering Pinsight in the UK and with some of their clients that are using it globally.
Absolutely, and I'm delighted to say we've just won an award for the work that we do with Pinsight. We've won this award here in the UK, given to us by Corporate Vision, all around some of the ways we've used Pinsight to enable our clients to arrive at relevant, cost-effective and effective solutions that have led to some really good results in terms of both assessment for selection purposes, but also in terms of engaging employees, particularly around their future development. So we're absolutely thrilled, and we've been thrilled to be part of Pinsight from that point of view as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Janice. That's great news and very exciting accomplishment for the Scala Group and Pinsight.
Yeah, thank you.
So before we dive in a little bit deeper to the webinar today, I wanted to start with some research studies, just taking a look at what is the state of strategic HR right now. So we know that this has been a topic for many years, perhaps decades, in terms of the importance of strategic HR. And today, we find that only about 40% of business and HR leaders are reporting that they're ready to address skill gaps in HR. And so this might seem like a low percentage. However, this is actually up 30% since 2015. So while there's arguably still room for improvement here, it's very clear that a lot of improvement has been made in the recent years. We did this poll with one of the blogs we released on this topic earlier this month. And granted, we have a small number of respondents. The results here suggest, based on the question, is HR more strategic than a decade ago? The results suggest that people largely feel that HR departments today are at least as strategic as they were a decade ago, with many feeling that they're actually more strategic today. So again, there's certainly progress that is being made. However, there still exists some disconnect here. So research suggests for 2005 that about 85% of HR professionals believe practicing strategic HR is important or very important. Yet at the same time, 72% are reporting that they revise or adapt HR strategy reactively rather than proactively. And so one of the things we'll speak to today is the importance of that proactive approach for a truly strategic outlook. So with that, I'll introduce the agenda. In today's webinar, we'll go through ways to determine how strategic your HR function currently is, how to identify and replace non-strategic HR practices, and then we'll conclude with some actionable tips for building strategic thinking habits. Before we dive into that, I wanted to give Janice the opportunity to speak a little bit more generally about the role of an HR business partner. So Janice, would you mind telling us a little bit more about how you see the role of an HR business partner?
Thank you, Christy. Yes, as the slide suggests, it's a bit of a balancing act, and it's a balancing act between strategic and operational needs. And I'm not at all surprised at your statistic, which shows that HR people feel that they have become more strategic than they were some years back, because that absolutely matches the business needs. It's relevant completely to the environment that we operate in today. We're in a fast-paced world, and in order to keep up, we need to be able to have a strategic overview. We need to be able to scan the horizon, to look ahead. And our role in HR, I believe, is very much to be supporting our line managers, supporting the business in these strategic skills, and working with the business in looking ahead. Managers need to look externally at what competitors are doing. They need to look ahead and spot trends on the horizon and formulate future plans. There's a big need to create innovation, and managers need to be able to create an environment that fosters innovation. Development is key here. Part of this development is to be able to give people open, positive and constructive feedback. And certainly I believe passionately in the value of self-awareness, the self-awareness that, yes, you get from feedback from people, but the sort of feedback that you get also from doing some sort of an assessment program, such as Pinsight. There's a third role, I think, that is also part of the strategic function of the HR business partner, and that of course is to help managers make sure that their people are aligned with the challenges that they're spotting on the horizon, that the challenges they're spotting in the environment, and the strategic goals that they're setting. HR people need to be able to work with their managers to be sure that they're helping people to develop the right capabilities, and that these capabilities are ready, that the people are ready with these capabilities when they're needed. So I see these, essentially these 3 points, as being the key strategic parts of the role of the HR business partner, which is to help managers look ahead, spot the trends and set the strategies, align people with those challenges, and create an environment that fosters innovation. We all know that, of course, it's often difficult, and that's where the balancing act comes in, because, of course, HR business partners also have a key operational role. There are day-to-day problems. There's also the need to make sure that the strategy is being implemented as planned, And I believe strongly that HR business partners also have a role in making sure that the culture of the organisation moves in the right direction. And of course, the problem is that operational needs often have an urgency to them, and so managers and HR tend to get caught up in the day-to-day. So certainly having some appropriate initiatives that are able to help HR help their business partners to fulfill the valuable strategic role, I think is absolutely essential.
Great, thank you, Janice. As Janice highlighted, it's certainly a balancing act between the strategic needs and the operational needs. Naturally, this webinar will focus a little bit more on that strategic needs, but we did want to make the point that we realize that there is this balancing act, that it's not just about the strategic focus in terms of the role of the HR business partner. So with that, we'll talk a little bit more here about what is strategic HR. And for this definition we've provided here, we've integrated across the research literature and published literature in terms of what it means to be strategic in HR. And we've tried to capture a few of the most defining characteristics in this definition. So the first part of this is really proactively seeking to align all talent. So as Janet spoke to, really looking ahead and trying to spot trends proactively to be able to align really all talent with those business goals. And again, using innovation and innovative research-based talent management practices. When we were preparing for this webinar, Janice, you were speaking to kind of the needs of managing the different performance levels. Would you be able to say a little bit more about that here as it relates to kind of the role of strategic HR?
Yeah, absolutely. The key part of being able to manage different performance levels is, of course, to be able to identify what your performance standards are. What is it that you want your people to do? What is it that you want them to achieve? And how will you know that they have achieved these levels? And this is a very key part of being able to manage performance, and it's often a key part. It's a key area that is often a bit neglected, and sometimes I think that too much emphasis is placed on dealing with poor performance and not enough is placed on being able to differentiate between satisfactory performance and high performance, and to be able to really be clear and give recognition of the difference between the two.
Thank you, Janice. You put that much more eloquently than my summary of your perspective on that would be, so I appreciate you sharing that. The last part of this definition that we wanted to highlight is the integral part of the business and really being a trusted advisor to senior leaders. So research suggests that it doesn't really matter necessarily, well, it certainly matters, but it's not always as important exactly how strategic HR if the non-HR leaders don't believe in this value. So being really a trusted advisor, someone that other senior leaders, non-HR leaders, see as someone that is strategic as a way to help accomplish and deliver results, make an impact, and help align with those business goals is of course a key part of the strategic HR role as well. So this slide gets at kind of differentiating different levels of strategic HR. And so we've broken this into 3 different categories, and of course this is a bit simplified for the purpose of demonstration. But the idea here is that we have kind of the traditional HR, strategic HR, and then really what we're arguing is that the future is really morphing this more into a talent management role. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about each of these 3, and if you haven't already looked at the infographic that we have on this we posted earlier this month, that might be something that you'll find helpful as well. So in terms of traditional HR, typically what we see in traditional HR departments is there is an HR department. There is some kind of basic performance system in place, so maybe annual performance reviews or performance appraisals. Also some type of training or promotion practices exist, but they might be a bit outdated in terms of maybe they're a bit basic in that foundation. Maybe it's a training program, but it's not necessarily specific for different positions or roles within the organization. It's a bit more general. And the focus in traditional HR is a focus on the past and past performance and in past trends. And as Janice mentioned, part of the role of strategic is really looking ahead and starting to spot those trends. So with strategic HR, we start to see that focus on both the future and the past, although there is some emphasis still on the past needs and past performance. We start to see that development and succession planning is a priority. So perhaps there's more formal training programs that focus on acquiring skills for both current and future roles, a formal system in place for leadership development or for succession planning and tracking of successors over time. Hopefully some sort of feedback system for employees beyond just an annual performance review. And in strategic HR, we start to see this emphasis on ROI and evaluation. So really evaluating HR practices and evaluating the development practices that we're doing with employees to see, is this really achieving the ROI that we're hoping for? And if not, where can changes be made to make sure that we're getting the most out of this from both an organizational perspective in terms of ROI, but also from the employee perspective to make sure that we're truly investing in growing our talent pool. And then the third phase we have here is what we've labeled talent management. So here the focus is much more future focused, so measuring readiness of potential successors, looking forward towards the trends and what those business goals might be, so that we can align talent with those future goals. In the talent management category, we tend to see that there is an emphasis on evaluation. So data is really driving those business goals or the business decisions along with the business goals or the business strategies that have been operationalized. And we also tend to see that there's more of a focus on what we call experiential learning. So realizing that training and development aren't necessarily one and the same. That training is much more focused on skill acquisition, development we're much more focused on, or I'm sorry, training is more focused on knowledge acquisition and development more focused on skill acquisition for both the current role but also future looking, so not necessarily specific to that role that individual is currently in. Janet, Janice, anything you would like to add in terms of the different levels of strategic HR function and how we are differentiating them here?
No, I think that I think that puts it all brilliantly. And the point that I think I would want to just emphasize here is that I believe very strongly that when you're looking at all of these strategic HR and talent management concepts, all of these issues, that you need to take an inclusive approach. I've always been an advocate of inclusive talent management. I think we have a lot of evidence that exclusive approaches can lead to more problems than the advantages that they bring, because they tend to lead to discontent if you can't match all the expectations that you raise. Plus, of course, they create elites in the organisation, which is not always a good thing. And so what is important is about opening opportunity for everyone in the organisation. But having said that, you need to be able to find ways of identifying the future performance and potential, and you need to measure the readiness of successors. And so what I would say is that it's about having a number of approaches and a number of tools and initiatives available to suit all the different needs so that you are able that way to take an inclusive approach to talent, and offering as much opportunity and particularly self-awareness opportunity or development of self-awareness to as many people as possible. And I think, you know, that's, you know, if I can mention Pinsight here, I think that, of course, is one of the advantages of Pinsight, because it does enable you to do that, because it's cost-effective and easy to administer.
Thank you, Janice, for that addition. Now we'll transition to talking a little bit more about some factors that are really preventing HR from being more strategic. And the first one that we'll discuss is really this lack of formal and strategic talent management practices. So this incorporates many different practices that fall under here, such as leadership development, training, succession planning. And the first step for all of these is really directly connecting them with the business goals. So in one moment, we'll talk a little bit more about how to define those business goals and what that might look like to ensure that connection with talent management practices. But then once those business goals and objectives are defined, it really means translating that to what does that mean for different levels of leadership, different levels of employees, different units, different departments. And making this translation is often requires a collaboration with those unit leaders, department leaders, or senior management in those areas, because they really know best how that operational strategy will translate into practice, and making sure that it's as concrete and as clear as possible with each of these different practices will help ensure that strategic focus is realized. So in terms of leadership development, of course, development, as I mentioned before, should really focus on the skill acquisition, and it's best suited for situations, or leadership development is really best suited for situations where the goal is not only acquiring broader skills for the current position, but also that future focus. So it also requires some contemplation and consideration of what is that future focus for particular levels of leadership, for particular individuals in those levels. Succession planning is also a key part of this. So there was a research study done in 2014 between, it was a collaboration with the Stanford University Graduate School and the Institute of Executive Development, and they interviewed a number of board members and executives to really better understand how top performing companies, so what they consider best-in-class organizations, are doing in terms of succession planning. And this was a key component for all of those best-in-class organizations. And it wasn't just a matter of identifying successors reactively, but it was a very proactive approach that they reported. So taking a large group of individuals, not just a few, and really mapping their development and their course, their trajectory over the period of many years. And they found that with this very deliberate plan process, heavily based on analytics throughout this whole process, that's really what was differentiating some of these top or best-in-class organizations from others. And then certainly at the earlier stages of the employee life cycle, onboarding and hiring, sometimes these can be a little bit more overlooked in terms of aligning this with the strategic priorities, but of course these are equally as important. So research suggests that the onboarding programs are absolutely critical for achieving maximum productivity and improving long-term retention, of course organizational commitment, and then that alignment with the business strategies and strategic focus. And likewise with hiring, so making sure that at this stage in the employee life cycle that it's still a strategic decision based on where the company is currently, what the expectations for that new role or position are, and then an evaluation of that internal candidate pool. So as Janice spoke to, really being able to accurately assess the current talent pool to be able to make these types of hiring decisions and determine when looking outside might be the best approach given the strategic direction the company wishes to take. This is some of the recommendations we have for identifying business strategies, and we propose this three-step approach. The first step is collecting that organizational information. Of course, most of this should should be common information for HR professionals and others to acquire within the organization, but this includes examining really the size, the structure, the mission, the vision, the values, and then also trying to spot trends. So what are the industry trends? Where is the industry moving? What might be future barriers or future challenges that the company is going to need to face? The second step is the key interview, in interviews with executives and key stakeholders, really asking concrete and specific questions about what are the current business objectives and what are the future business objectives. And when we look over the next 12 months or 24 months, where do we see these objectives going, and what is our talent going to need to be able to do to help us achieve these objectives? And then likewise thinking about what are the situations we're most likely to encounter over the next 12 months or 24 months. And then we recommend integrating this information to determine really what are the 2 to 3 most key priorities for any position or unit or role. We offer a variety of business strategies that have been validated based on our research. So this comes from some of the simulations that we offer here at Kinsight. And all of our simulations are really tied to that business strategy. So what you're looking at is the different strategies for the 8 levels of, 8 different strategies for the 3 different levels of leadership. And one thing that makes this approach helpful is that they're cascading in the sense that once you start with the senior leadership team and you define really what are the organizational strategies that our senior leadership team is focused on, then we can translate that down through levels of leadership to understand really what does that mean for other levels. So for example, establishing a strategic direction is important for our senior leadership team, but at the manager level that really means that we need our managers aligning the team with that organizational strategy. So turning to additional factors that are preventing HR from being more strategic, we again have that focus on past performance and not enough focus on future potential. So more commonly, at least here in the US, the basis for these decisions for most talent management decisions is typically past performance. So looking back and understanding how did this person perform over the past year, and that's really not doing us many favors in terms of trying to look ahead and be strategic with the decisions that we're making. Our past performance of an individual, particularly if it's in a different role than where we want them moving, is really only going to tell us so much, if anything, about that individual's future potential. And so related to this, it becomes important to define potential for what role, for what strategic priorities. And without answering these questions about potential, it's very difficult to define and measure potential, and it becomes very difficult to align our talent with that future potential and the business objectives we're moving towards. So at Kinsight, we think about potential as much more than current skills, as I mentioned, or past performance. We think about it as a combination of a number of different factors that influences a person's potential. The first one is their current skill level. So this isn't necessarily looking backwards. This is taking a snapshot at the moment. So what are the individual skills and weaknesses at this current moment to really understand what is their current skill set and how is this going to help with the strategies we need them to achieve. We also take into account their motivation or their personality alignment with the skills that are necessary for achieving strategic priorities. And the third factor here is learning agility. So this really comes from decades of research that suggests individuals vary in their ability and their willingness to want to learn new skills and acquire new skills, and that this orientation towards learning will have a significant impact on both the rate at which they can develop new skills as well as their ability to do so and to eventually execute those skills. And then the final factor is the ease of development. So we recognize that skills vary and how easy or difficult that they are to develop, and when considering potential, it's important for us to consider for each individual what are their skill gaps and how easy or difficult are those particular skills to develop. And then we take this a step further to really link this to readiness. So what does this mean in terms of this individual's readiness for executing? And then again, it's always tied to the strategy. So is this individual ready now for executing, enhancing efficiency of operations, or where does that fall? Which allows us to more concretely define talent pools, which we'll speak to in a little bit more here in a moment as well. And the last factor in terms of preventing HR from becoming more strategic is really poor analytics for making decisions. So the research study that I spoke to previously about best-in-class organizations, one of those organizations that was identified is PepsiCo. And the quote that came out of this study from some of the interviews that they do is that they really emphasize the importance of sticking to the analytics and identifying and tracking talent and succession based on these analytics. So I know here in the U.S. we commonly use manager ratings as the primary analytic for making decisions. And there's a number of issues with that approach. Not only the past-looking nature of that data, but also asking managers to evaluate things that they don't necessarily have time to do. They're not necessarily equipped to be able to make these objective ratings. When Janice and I were preparing for this webinar, she spoke to how this emphasis on manager ratings and past performance is not really something that's as common as in the UK as we see here in the US. So Janice, would you like to speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, I mean, this comes right into the debate that's going on at the moment around performance appraisal and how performance appraisal is carried out, and to do with whether managers give ratings, and also, of course, forced ranking. Forced ranking has never been popular in the UK. And in fact, the use of ratings has not been as widespread in the UK as it has been in the US, although it has been very, very common. I mean, my views around all of this is that it is very important for managers to be able to assess performance. And I'm not completely against ratings. I think that there is a place for ratings in the same way as I think that there is a place for connecting performance appraisal ratings with pay. It should not be the only input into pay awards, but it is can often be a valuable input into pay awards. And I think that there's a need in organisations to upskill managers and to help them be able to make assessment ratings of performance. I think this is in addition to then being able to give objectively gathered information about people and their performance and put that into the mix. So what I'm saying is that conversations about people should be about both the as managers' ratings, which need to be made as reliably and consistently as possible. Those ratings should be put together with some other data that has been collected objectively, for example, through an assessment centre type programme. So I think there's a place for the two. And of course the assessment centre type programme can be run so that it gives you data on potential and you can have far more meaningful conversations when you put the two together. Certainly I think just basing strategic decisions around manager ratings is missing a trick. It's giving you less reliable data on which to make the decision, and in particular it's not giving you necessarily an indication of how somebody might perform in a new role or how they might take on new challenges.
Thank you, Janice. That was a good segue as well into the next slide, which is with more robust analytics. As Janice mentioned, it allows for really more concretely predicting and defining how individuals fall into different talent pools. And the advantage of this approach is that we know, depending on where someone falls in terms of the talent pools or their development plan, that there's different types of investments, and these of course vary in terms of the resources involved for these various investments, and really to maximize the investment in terms of leadership and development programs and practices. We find that it's very important to concretely define those talent pools so that you know where someone's at, so that you can really target that investment and the development approach based on where that individual is at and based on what they really truly need. So taking more of an individualized approach, and the more robust analytics will allow for making these decisions based on data rather than subjective opinions or other types of input that may be used. And then related to that, so the last factor that we'll speak to is really a lack of formal standardized evaluation of practices. And we see this as a very key component to becoming more strategic, is having those formal and objective practices, but also still making sure that really everything's being evaluated, whether that's hiring practices or training practices or development practices, to be able to translate this into an ROI and really understand, are we maximizing our investment of this, and are we really getting what we want to achieve out of this various program. So I've heard a number of clients say before they don't want to do post-training evaluation, or they don't want to do this evaluation because what if it doesn't support their program? What if it turns out that their program wasn't effective, and what kind of flags would that raise? And I'd argue that it's better to know that you have data that your program's not working than to continue using something that's not working effectively over many courses of employees or years. And really, so with this evaluation, having the knowledge to know when something isn't working or when something is working, so that you can continue to develop and improve practices to make sure that we're making the impact that we're really seeking to with the investment. On that note, here I have an example of evaluating and tracking the effectiveness in a systemized and systematic and standardized way. So in this example, one of our clients, Denver Public Schools, systematically tracked the cohorts of high potentials who participated in our pin site simulations and then subsequent development as compared to leaders that did not participate in this simulation. And by systematically tracking this, we were able to really calculate what was the return on investment and thereby justify the additional expenses associated with it. So in this specific example, they had invested around $150,000 in terms of the simulations to develop their leaders. In this case, it was school principals. And what they found is, compared to the group that did not experience this, they had a 13% lower turnover rate. So when we translate this, assuming that replacement costs are about 100% of an annual salary, which is arguably a conservative estimate, we found that they saved close to $3 million in terms of employee replacement costs, and this is just taking into account those replacement costs. It's not accounting for morale or lost knowledge or any of the other factors that we know are associated with turnover, resulting in about a 2,000% return on that investment. So with this type of evaluation, they were really able to build a business case as to why something like this is needed for their senior leadership team. So in terms of identifying non-strategic HR practices, we have a couple questions here just to consider. And we would argue that, or I would argue, if the answer to any of these is really no, then there's room for improvement in terms of making it more strategic. So the first question is, of course, the future focus. directly tied to the strategic priorities, really going to deliver the analytics that we need to make decisions. So it's not just about having robust and data-driven analytics, but it's also about making sure that this is aligned for the decisions that we need to make. Finally, evaluated in terms of effectiveness and allowing us to objectively differentiate standards of performance. So as Janice spoke to earlier, really being able to differentiate performance so that we're not just focused on poor performers or high performers, but that we're able to really differentiate these different standards of performance so that we can tailor talent management to fit the needs of the various groups. Janice, anything you'd add here in terms of identifying non-strategic HR practices?
No, I think you've covered that all absolutely brilliantly.
The
non-strategic that covers it all. There are of course always a myriad of day-to-day issues that arise that need to be dealt with people. But aside from that, which is slightly outside of the agenda here anyhow, but aside from that, this covers it all.
Great, thank you. So in the last part of this webinar, we'll transition to building skills and building strategic thinking habits. So at Pinsight, we're a big proponent of not only developing a skill to the point of a proficiency or strength, but taking it a step further to really make it a habit. So habits are automatic, they're natural responses for us, we don't have to think about them, they become very, very easy for us to display, they don't require a ton of effort or cognitive demands because they become automatic. So for example, if we think about driving a car, it would be a very strenuous process if every time we had to go somewhere, we had to stop and think about each piece. So hitting the gas, hitting the brake, turning on turn signals, or merging lanes. But for most people, at least at this point in our lives, this has become a habit for us to where we can quickly go from point A to point B without thinking about all these micro steps in between because it has become a habit. And so at Pinsight, we're of the opinion, and this comes from the habit formation and the expertise literature, that really any skill can become a habit with enough practice and enough repetition. And that's the approach we take to developing skills, and that's what we're proposing here in terms of strategic thinking skills. So we have 3 skills that are related to strategic thinking. The first one, taking that strategic perspective. So this is defined as really scanning the broad environment inside and outside the organization to gain additional insight. Second one is formulating a concrete vision. So this involves not only creating the vision, but also a really vivid communication of this in a way that appeals to followers' values. And then finally, setting strategic priorities. So successfully implementing the vision and perspective really happens through identifying a manageable set of strategic priorities based on a logical analysis. So the recommendations to follow, and we're running short on time, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions and answers, so I'll go through this rather quickly. But our recommendations to follow are based on what we call 5 minutes a day, the principle that if anyone works on something just a couple minutes each and every day, that it starts to build that behavior into a habit. And the research suggests that after about 66 days or so of continuous practice, a skill starts to become that habit. It starts to become less effortful and doesn't require as much cognitive thinking and capacity to be able to demonstrate that skill or that habit. So that's been the approach that we take, and we'll go through this relatively quickly just so that we have enough time for questions and answers. But I do recommend, we recently released an ebook that dives into this a little bit deeper, provides a lot of these micro actions or tiny habits that I'll speak to here in a moment, and then also provides a way to track these and suggestions for practicing these to become a habit. So there's a couple examples. I'll show a few examples for each. The first one is taking a strategic perspective. And the critical questions to ask for developing this skill or habit include, how can I gain the organizational-wide perspective that I need? What are competitors doing? What is the workforce? How does the workforce affect the organization's values and goals? So the 3 development suggestions we have here are what we consider micro actions or tiny habits, ways that you can start to build the skill with single or with small practice every day. So the first one, identifying one source inside or outside the organization that could provide broad information about various parts. And with all of these, we recommend really setting a cue. So maybe it's when you first get to work and you open your computer, you'll sit down to think about some of these things. But that cue is a key component in terms of remembering to practice this behavior daily, because as our lives get busy and we have a number of other needs, it's easy to forget about these things. So that's why that cue becomes really important, developing it or defining a time when you'll have the time to think through these things, spend a couple minutes doing it, and something that you'll consistently face every day. So for example, opening your computer or taking a coffee break or whatever it may be, something that's daily that can be considered dependable from day to day. The second one is formulating the concrete vision. And so the critical question here is, who does my vision affect? Where will the company be in 5 years? And how do I get people on board with this vision? And again, the development suggestions we have are really aligned at achieving this overall goal of formulating a concrete vision. So one example here is record 2 to 3 ideas about what the company will look like in 3 to 5 years. Or practice an elevator speech describing your vision to colleagues and seek their feedback. This can also be describing this to individuals outside your organization. That can always be a helpful way to provide additional insight as well. And then the third strategy or development suggestions we offer is set strategic priorities. And the critical questions here are, what are the problems that need to be addressed? What is your competition focused on? And what kind of time constraints exist? So the development suggestions here are focused around that larger goal. For example, write down one reasonable strategic goal and one ideal strategic goal for the year. So really starting to differentiate what is something that's feasible and really what's our ideal. Or another example, record 2 ways that the vision and priorities create a competitive advantage. So as I mentioned, the ebook will go into more detail and provides a lot more actionable and concrete steps for developing these skills and practicing them. And I encourage you to take a look at that if that's something that you're interested in. So I'd like to wrap up with some concluding thoughts, and then we have a couple minutes here for question and answer. So the first concluding thought is, as Janice started us off with, the HR business partner is both operational and strategic. Of course, the focus of this webinar is on that strategic component, but we realize that is one component. That's not the entire role of an HR business partner. A couple characteristics that we see in terms of importance for strategic focus is that forward-looking, a heavy reliance on analytics, aligning all talent for the business goals or the business strategies, and then again becoming that trusted advisor. So allowing non-HR leaders to see the importance and the value and the results, so that the HR business partner is really someone that is seen as a trusted advisor by non-HR partners as well. And then finally, as we just discussed, strategic thinking is a skill that can be developed until it becomes a habit. So we're of the mindset that really any skill can be developed into the point of a habit, and that is the goal that we strive for, at least with the leadership development programs that we do. Janice, anything else you would add to the webinar before we turn it over to see what questions there might be?
I think that puts it all beautifully, Christy.
Thank you, Janice. Great. So let's we'll open it up for questions now. If you have any, feel free to put them in the question box, and I'll monitor that and then answer them as they come in. So one question that has come in is regarding the balance of the operational and strategic focus. Any recommendations on how to achieve that balance? And Janice, I'll let you speak to that if you're comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. It really comes down to discipline, but also to have hone your strategic thinking skills, because the more your skills are honed, then the more automatically it will come to you, and therefore the strategic part of the role will come into how you're doing things on an everyday basis. I also think that having some processes and systems in place that will force you to take a strategic approach, strategic initiatives such as the Pinsight initiative, such as these development initiatives that Christy has been talking about. I think these are things that can help enormously, but at the end of the day it boils down to being disciplined about it. And part of being disciplined about it is just knowing, having it at the forefront of your mind, that it's something that is really important. Good luck with it.
Thank you, Janice. Another question that has come in is, we've spoken to the relevance of Pinsight, but I apologize that it didn't really take a lot of time at the beginning to explain what Pinsight was. So the question is, how does Pinsight really relate to this topic and help HR become more strategic? So in terms of what we do at Pinsight, I'll step back, and my apologies for assuming this was understood already. But Pinsight, we specialize in virtual assessment centers, or virtual simulations for leaders. And the goal behind Pinsight is not only that assessment component, so helping build that self-awareness, but also taking that a step further so that there are concrete and actionable development steps that follow. So our goal is that it's not a really once and done activity, that both the assessment and the development component are continuous. So our reports are really geared in that way, in terms of offering information about these are actionable steps that individual can take, similar to the development suggestions we've offered here. Also providing those readiness estimates and an indication of potential for individuals. And then finally, everything in the Pinsight report is always tied to business strategies, so that really is an important decision to make at the forefront of the process, and to keep in mind throughout that entire process, for ensuring that the analytics are always based on the strategic priorities for that individual. So there's really no way to look at those results without considering that strategic priority. Janice, is there anything you'd want to add? I know you've been a frequent user of Pinsight with your clients, and given the award you just won, is there anything you'd want to add in terms of Pinsight and how it relates to our topic today?
What I would say is that Pinsight, we find that it is a key way of helping both HR people and their managers, the business, to become more strategic, because it does give this focus on identifying future strategies, on thinking about the skills that are needed to achieve these strategies, and then of course it gives people this extremely valuable opportunity to test drive a role, to test drive a future role, or to test drive how they might tackle some future challenges, and to identify the gap between where they are now and where they need to be, the skills gap that they need to develop in order to get to where they need to be in the future, where the business needs to be in the future. And Pinsight is very flexible for helping both HR and business and individuals themselves achieve a whole variety of different needs. So how you build a process around Pinsight can help you achieve quite a wide range of different business needs.
Great, thank you, Janice. So with that, we are just about out of time. So I'll transition to letting you know what you can do if you do have additional questions. On the screen, you'll see both my contact information and Janice's. So please feel free to reach out to either of us with questions about today's webinar or really anything. And then likewise, I did want to mention there'll be a short survey that you'll receive after this webinar. It'll be just a few questions. It's one of the ways we evaluate our webinars. So it's valuable information for us. Additionally, in that questionnaire, there will be one item or one question about if you're seeking HR certification credit. So please be sure to indicate there if that's something that you're looking for, and then we'll follow up and provide you the activity ID to submit. Thank you, Janice, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you on this webinar and to have to hear about all your expertise and experience in this regard. So thank you, Janice, for joining, and thank you, everyone, for taking an hour to spend with us today.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.